There's a saying that nothing hurts more than unrequited love, when your feelings are not returned. Many people have found themselves in such a situation, and sometimes in their pain, they made rash decisions that led to lifelong regret. Such is the story of a young woman in the following case. Blinded by love, she harmed her ex-boyfriend, leading to a tragic outcome for both of them. It was a morning in September 2015 in Bristol, England, when the peaceful air was suddenly shattered by blood-curdling screams. Curious neighbors looked outside and were stunned to see a man staggering down the street, nearly naked, wearing only underwear. At first, many thought dark patches on his body were mud, but as they approached, they were horrified to discover that it was his skin, severely peeling due to an acid attack. In agonizing pain, the man cried out for help, but those nearby could only watch in helpless shock. When paramedics arrived, even they were stunned by the severity of the injuries. This was the most brutal acid attack they had ever encountered. However, what they saw that day was only the beginning of a chilling case, where human cruelty led a promising life down a road of unimaginable tragedy. Today, we will explore the heartbreaking case of Mark van Dongen, a talented young engineer who became entangled in a toxic relationship and faced devastating consequences no one could have foreseen. But first, let's take a look at the victim and his relationship. Mark van Dongen was a Dutch national, born and raised in his home country. His father, Cornelius van Dongen, known as Kees, described Mark as a gentle, compassionate son with deep empathy. Even as a child, Mark showed kindness, often returning marbles he'd won in games so his friends wouldn't feel sad. Mark studied civil engineering and consistently achieved excellent results. Driven and ambitious, he worked hard to succeed in both academics and career. After finishing his studies in the Netherlands, Mark moved to Bristol, UK, to pursue job opportunities and professional growth. This decision marked a turning point in his life. Unfortunately, a tragic one. While living in the UK, Mark met Bina Wallace, a student from South Africa. They began dating in 2010, and their relationship initially appeared smooth. The two quickly became close and decided to live together with hopes of building a future. Mark was deeply in love with Bina, and he invested greatly in the relationship, not only emotionally, but also financially. However, over time, warning signs began to appear. Bina started showing emotional instability, which worried Mark's friends and family. She became overly controlling, frequently angry, and emotionally manipulative. Their arguments became increasingly intense. Friends began noticing scratches and bruises on Mark. Once, Bina even poured boiling water on him while he was sleeping. That's completely insane, right? But when Mark went to the hospital for his burns, he told the doctors he had accidentally spilled tea on himself. Those close to Mark believed this wasn't the first time Bina had harmed or threatened him. Whenever he tried to leave, she used psychological manipulation and even threatened to harm herself, putting Mark in a difficult position, torn between escaping a toxic relationship and concern for her safety. Despite everything, Mark stayed in the relationship for 5 years until August 2015. He finally reached his limit and made the extremely difficult decision to break up with Bina and start a new chapter. He met another woman named Violet Farson online, and they quickly started a new relationship. But Bina couldn't accept the breakup so easily. She continued to send Mark a series of emotionally charged messages, some guilt-ridden, others threatening. These messages left Mark confused and distressed, unsure how to end the never-ending conversation. Still, Mark tried to remain calm and offered to continue supporting Bina financially, even after the breakup, hoping this would help her settle down and stop the extreme behavior. He believed that by remaining compassionate, things could be resolved without further harm to either of them. However, his patience proved useless. Bina became increasingly unstable, not just out of jealousy, but also from an obsessive desire to possess him. Her behavior spiraled further into extremity. Mark and his new girlfriend were constantly harassed with silent, unexplained phone calls. This created overwhelming fear, as Mark felt not only watched, but also began to fear for the safety of both himself and his new partner. The situation worsened after Mark heard from one of Bina's friends that she was planning to harm herself, both because of her heartbreak and to make Mark suffer for leaving her. After hearing that, Mark told his father and friends that he was deeply worried about what Bina might do next, but he also felt responsible for checking in on her regularly. By September 2015, Mark decided to try and resolve everything peacefully, hoping to end the misunderstandings and conflicts for good. However, what followed was a horrifying event he could never have anticipated. That night, around 10 p.m., Mark visited Bina's apartment one last time, intending to firmly end their relationship. He had already told his new girlfriend, Violet, that he was going to break things off for good so he could move forward with his life. As soon as Mark arrived, the conversation quickly escalated. Bina couldn't accept that Mark truly wanted to leave, despite his efforts to calmly explain, as Violet later recalled. Bina's increasingly intense attitude pushed the situation to a breaking point, and then beyond, leading to devastating consequences. It seemed Bina had been bottling up all her anger. Around 3 a.m., while Mark was asleep in just his boxer shorts, she suddenly woke him, but not in a normal way. She woke him with a bottle of acid. Screaming in rage, Bina shouted that if she couldn't have him, no one could. Before Mark had time to react, she threw sulfuric acid on his face and body. The liquid instantly began burning through his skin. Mark screamed in agony. Words can barely describe the pain he was in. He leapt out of bed, overwhelmed by an unbearable burning sensation, shouting in panic as he ran out of the apartment and into the street. Chunks of his skin were melting off. He cried out for help, waking neighbors who rushed to their windows. At first, the neighbors didn't realize the seriousness of the situation. Some thought it was just foxes screaming in the night. One person even grabbed a golf club and ran out to see what was going on. Someone spotted Mark and thought he was just covered in mud. But within moments, everyone was horrified to realize the truth. It wasn't mud. It was his own flesh, melting from acid. Terrified by Mark's condition, neighbors rushed him into a nearby apartment and placed him in a cold bath, hoping to ease the pain. But the damage was already catastrophic. When paramedics arrived, they found Mark gasping for air, enduring unimaginable pain. One medical worker discovered that his left eye had been completely destroyed by the acid. His face and upper body were severely burned. Mark could barely speak. Every word was broken by sheer agony. His body trembled from shock, and the acid still clinging to his skin continued to eat away at him, making things worse by the second. Despite his suffering, Mark managed to name his attacker, Bina. He also begged the medical team to check on his new girlfriend, fearing Bina might try to harm her as well. Meanwhile, Bina remained inside the apartment, calm and cold. While Mark screamed in pain outside, she didn't call for help. Instead, she picked up her phone and called a friend. She showed no sign of remorse or concern for what she had just done. Mark's face was horribly disfigured. One of his eyes was permanently damaged, leaving him partially blind. The first time he saw his reflection after the attack, he screamed in pain and despair. "I'd rather be dead than live like this." Although he received support from his father and medical staff, Mark was still mentally devastated. Unable to move his body, he had to use an alphabet board and move his tongue to communicate. It was his only way to express himself, slow, difficult, but the last shred of independence he had left. Mark's recovery was slow and excruciating. He had no choice but to keep fighting. Losing control over his body took a huge toll on his spirit. The constant physical pain pushed Mark into deep depression. His father, Keys, stayed by his side, doing his best to lift his son's spirits, but Mark's mental state continued to deteriorate. Police documented the full extent of Mark's injuries, but because they were so horrific, they decided not to release any images, not even to the media, in November 2016. Later, Mark was moved to a care home in Gloucester, but the conditions there were awful. When Mark's father drove over 800 miles to visit him, he was horrified to find his son neglected, covered in waste and begging for help. Shocked and furious, Keys vowed to get his son out of there at any cost. With help from friends, the family arranged for a medical transport to take Mark to Belgium, hoping he would receive better care. But even in Belgium, Mark's suffering didn't end. The acid had burned deep into his tissue, leaving holes in his body and causing unrelenting pain. Doctors did everything they could, but the hospital didn't have specialized facilities to treat injuries as severe as Mark's. It seemed like every second, his nerves were on fire. The acid had eaten through his flesh and even into his bones, making the pain unbearable. Despair surrounded Mark. Even after he made some progress, like regaining the ability to speak, he asked, "What's the point, if all I can do is lie here and stare at the ceiling?" As if things weren't bad enough, Mark's condition worsened when he developed a severe lung infection. Doctors had to perform a tracheotomy, cutting into his throat to insert a breathing tube. Though the procedure kept him alive, it also took away his ability to speak, the one thing left that let him connect with his father. To Mark, it was the final blow, extinguishing any last hope in a life now filled with pain and silence. In the depths of his despair, Mark decided to apply for euthanasia, a legal right in Belgium for individuals enduring unbearable, incurable suffering. Mark's request for assisted dying was carefully and thoroughly reviewed by 3 independent medical experts. All 3 reached the same conclusion. Mark was experiencing excruciating pain, both physically and mentally, with no hope for recovery. From a medical standpoint, his life had become nothing but torment, beyond salvation. As a result, they approved his request. On January 2, 2017, Mark spent his final moments with his father, who had promised to remain by his side through everything, until the very end. With immeasurable love, his father chose to stay and witness his son's final moments, offering comfort and dignity, even though it meant watching him go. At 7:15 that evening, doctors administered the euthanasia procedure, injecting a dose directly into his heart. Mark's life, marked by unimaginable pain, came to an end at just 29 years old, leaving behind deep sorrow and grief for his family, friends, and all who loved him. Nearly 3 years after the horrific attack, in April 2018, Bina Wallace finally faced trial, bringing her crimes into the light. Before the jury, Bina continued to insist on her innocence, denying all charges of murder and manslaughter. She claimed she had no idea the bottle contained acid and believed she was only throwing water on Mark. However, her testimony quickly crumbled under the prosecution's cross-examination. Undeniable evidence was presented, proving her actions were deliberate. Notably, she had purchased concentrated sulfuric acid in Berlin, intentionally removed the label from the bottle, and conducted multiple online searches about acid attacks, clearly showing premeditation. The prosecution argued that Bina didn't simply want to hurt Mark. She wanted to destroy him, to leave him disfigured and disabled, unable to live a normal life, and unloved by anyone ever again. Witnesses also shed light on the toxic nature of their relationship, revealing that Mark had not only been controlled and manipulated, but also psychologically abused by Bina's obsessive jealousy. Though Mark initially survived the attack, the severity of his injuries left him in prolonged, agonizing pain, eventually leading him to the heartbreaking decision to request assisted dying. During the trial, the prosecutor asserted that Bina Wallace's act of throwing acid on Mark was the direct cause of his death. They emphasized that this wasn't just a moment of rage or an impulsive act. It was calculated, deliberate, and extraordinarily cruel, with no justification. The prosecutor argued that although Mark may have requested euthanasia due to his unbearable condition, it was Bina's act of throwing acid on him that directly caused his death. Therefore, the prosecution decided to charge her with murder, stating that Bina was fully responsible for Mark's death and that her actions were a severe violation of another person's right to life. However, Bina's defense team presented a different argument. Her lawyer admitted that while the acid attack was serious and undeniable, Bina did not intend to kill Mark. Instead, she only wanted to cause him pain, to make him not want to live anymore, as a twisted form of revenge after everything that had happened between them. In the end, the jury could not conclude that Bina's actions amounted to murder or manslaughter, even though the case was heartbreaking. They agreed that while the acid attack was cruel and caused devastating harm, there wasn't enough evidence to prove Bina had intended to kill Mark from the outset. As a result, after reviewing the evidence and testimonies, the court found Bina not guilty of the 2 major charges, leading to public outrage and shock. However, she was still convicted of throwing a corrosive substance with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, a serious offense for which she received a 12-year prison sentence. Although this sentence brought some sense of justice, many people, especially Mark's family, felt that the punishment didn't come close to matching the suffering Mark had endured. The case sparked widespread outrage and ignited public debate about the use of acid as a weapon. It prompted conversations about tightening regulations and increasing penalties for crimes involving corrosive substances. Growing concern about acid attacks eventually led to the creation of the Offensive Weapons Act in 2019. This law introduced age restrictions on purchasing corrosive products and banned home delivery of certain high-concentration chemicals. Retailers also voluntarily strengthened their policies to control the sale of dangerous chemicals, especially after Bina's sentencing. To help prevent similar tragedies and support others from facing a fate like Mark's, his younger brother launched a crowdfunding campaign to support their father. The father, who was deeply emotionally affected and financially drained after the long struggle to care for his son, received aid through this campaign. Mark's brothers shared that their father had sacrificed everything to care for Mark. He spent months traveling back and forth between home and the hospital in Bristol, even sleeping in his car at the hospital parking lot to save money. He watched Mark suffer through unimaginable pain, losing a leg, an eye, an ear, and battling uncontrollable itching from scars so severe it nearly drove him to the edge mentally. The fundraising campaign received strong support from the community, with over 1,600 people donating and helping the family raise nearly 150% of the needed amount. This support wasn't just financial, it served as a powerful reminder of the cruelty Mark had endured. One haunting symbol of that pain is the doorbell Mark rang when he ran to a neighbor's house for help. It still bears marks from the attack, a lasting, painful reminder of what he went through. As of now, Bina Wallace has begun serving her sentence at a prison in the UK. However, the exact location of her imprisonment has not been disclosed due to inmate privacy regulations. Bina Wallace will be eligible to apply for early release in 2027, though that decision will depend entirely on her behavior during incarceration and will be thoroughly reviewed by the parole board. So, what do you think about the sentence given to Bina Wallace? Was it truly justice for the pain and suffering that Mark's family had to endure? And is there even a punishment severe enough to ease their loss? Or has justice not yet been fully served? Share your thoughts, because sometimes an objective perspective can open up deeper reflection on how the legal system delivers justice in serious cases like this. When it comes to the 12-year prison sentence given to Bina Wallace, it's certainly not a light penalty by legal standards for crimes involving corrosive substances. However, when you consider the outcome of her actions, the complete destruction of a man's life, leading to unimaginable suffering, and Mark's heartbreaking decision to end his life, many people understandably feel that this sentence does not measure up. Mark was not just the victim of an acid attack. He was the victim of prolonged physical and emotional abuse, and ultimately the stripping away of his right to live in the most horrific way possible. For many, especially his grieving family, 12 years cannot possibly reflect the cruelty and deep damage caused by that act. But the legal system must work based on evidence, intent, motive, and the limits of current law. This complexity created a gap between legal justice and emotional justice. In this case, because Mark passed away after choosing legal euthanasia, the jury struggled to establish a direct legal connection between the acid attack and his death. So is there any sentence that could truly ease the pain? Probably not. No punishment can bring Mark back or erase the haunting memories for his father, watching his son suffer day after day, screaming in agony. But justice isn't only about retribution, it's also about protecting the community and preventing future crimes. Mark's story reminds us of some important truths. Laws need to be continuously updated to reflect the realities of emerging forms of violence, such as acid attacks. Public education on recognizing toxic relationships and the signs of abuse is crucial. And most importantly, we must ensure that the right to life and personal freedom is always upheld, never dismissed, no matter the reason: love, jealousy, or heartbreak.